Good morning, everybody. So Tim introduced a theory-heavy kind of disquisition. I'll try to lighten the theory load a little bit, although there will be some people explicitly present and some others probably more as ghosts. So I just want to introduce Dennis Cosgrove, you might recognize. And the other person that is maybe a little bit less familiar is Edward Casey, and in particular his work on edges, borders, boundaries. His book, The World on Edge, came out last year, and is actually a rather interesting read in this context. If we're talking about landscape citizenships, and I'm going to deliberately use the plural here, and I'll explain that a little bit later, we have to consider that those citizenships are actually shaped by two entangled and codependent dimensions of belonging. The landscape belongs to its people, and its people also belong to the landscape. There are all kinds of claims and rights, but also responsibilities derived from these fundamental constructions of belonging and being in place, making it somewhat difficult to impossible to separate landscape from the people who inhabit it. Home and homeland, property and territory, garden and wilderness, culture and nature are potent constructs and material realities that are immensely consequential. Livelihoods depend on them, and wars have been fought over them. The formation of these and other identities and categories involves the drawing and making of boundaries and edges, and frequently those start as lines, very much like the common line, or also if you think about another kind of line, think of Richard Long and his practices of making lines by walking and other rituals of occupation in place. Those boundaries and edges then can be categorical, conceptual, and physical, while geophysical, ecological, and bioregional boundaries precede human experience. For example, watersheds, they're often traced, made meaningful and assigned value and consequence by humans. Others are preconceived by human mind and projected onto a place, often immaterial but nonetheless consequential, and often they are made manifest by physically changing a place, by something as subtle as a sign or incisive as a wall. Edges are fluid sites of negotiation, of construction and counter-construction, highly contested, seemingly separating, but in fact connecting. While the drawing of boundaries and edges within Renaissance, colonial, and capitalist thought has been about control, clarity, visibility, legibility, and stability, their actuality can be rather different. Edges can be ambiguous and ambivalent, porous and enabling. Many edges and thresholds, borders, boundaries present in landscapes are locations of what Anthony Wittler and others explore as the uncanny or the unhomely, places where the other, the strange, and the stranger, seen as unknown, often dangerous and threatening, make their presence known. The very edge, then, that is seen as a source of safety, order, and control, as for example the edge of a clearing, the wall of a home, or the fortification or walls of a city, becomes then de facto an opening, establishing a connection to the very things it aims to keep away and at bay. Homi Bhabha has reappropriated the uncanny to speak of the return of the migrants, the minorities, the diasporic, proposing the city as, quote, the space in which emergent identifications and new social movements of the people are played out, end quote. What he calls the perplexity of the living might be, in these terms, interpreted through a theory of edges and the uncanny that destabilizes traditional notions of center and periphery, the spatial forms of the national and the capital, and help to comprehend how that boundary that secures the cohesive limits of the Western nation may imperceptibly turn into a contentious internal liminality that provides a place from which to speak both of and as the minority, the exiling, the marginal, and the emergent. Contentious internal liminality. and the attendant modes of belonging as a foundation for contemporary, empowered, inclusive landscape citizenships will then have to focus on how edges and boundaries can be occupied, inhabited, and dwelt in new, creative, positive, and imaginative ways, instead of being seen as no man's lands of separation, no-go zones, and places to be avoided. I'm going to try to ground this a little bit, and I'm going to ground it in a very particular place, New Orleans, and in particular New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. A very small transgressive spatial intervention in the lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans, erected 3 years after Hurricane Katrina in the context of the rebuilding and recovery, tests this proposition. An important pretext is the long traditions of subaltern and transgressive uses of public spaces by African Americans in the city of New Orleans. The Black communities, economically, socially, and spatially marginalized, de facto living in an internal diaspora, have a long history of practices that create contentious internal liminalities, very much by the way of Desserteau's spatial tactics. One of the most visible expressions are the second lines, parades that sneak through New Orleans' poorest neighborhoods, organized by the descendants of the 19th century Black benevolent and mutual aid societies. These parades transform urban space, creating alternative social order by taking to the streets, ordinarily dominated by the quotidian order of inner-city poverty and spatial apartheid. In parading, residents craft a public sphere for cultural, social, and political expression and fashion the streets into a distinctive, relatively egalitarian public space that exists regardless of and sometimes in opposition to the government and its formal, institutional, political spheres of action. Attendant to this is the occupation of the white median strips typical of many streets in New Orleans by local residents, referred to as neutral grounds. Second lines and neutral grounds locate a complex of rituals and practices that create contentious internal liminality, a place both physically and positionally, where the minoric, exilic, and marginal can speak with power and stake counterclaims to assert its own identity and landscape, potently illustrating Bell Hook's notion of the margin as sites of resistance. The lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans exemplifies the realities of life and edge and life on the margin, prone to flooding, isolated by bodies of water on 3 sides and a former army barrack on the 4th, a long history of systemic and systematic discrimination, the site of some of the most significant destructions during Hurricane Katrina, but also home to communities that go back to the initial settlement by escaped slaves and established a long tradition of neighborhood activism. The lower Ninth Ward very early on became a critical location in the civil rights struggle and one of the first examples of school desegregation, and a traumatized community that was forced to prove its viability and right to exist after Hurricane Katrina. The lower Ninth Ward, writes Richard Campanella, might be said to embody the breadth of the build-no-build line between land to be abandoned and land to be maintained. The precarious position at the interface between coastal wetlands and human settlements. Levees and flat walls reduce Bienville's build-no-build line, really a more or less inhabitable zone of transition that is complex, variable, and contested, to a razor-thin line, physically inscribed into the landscape as a nearly 6-meter-tall sheet piling between a former cypress swamp and the lower Ninth Ward. It separates not just the lower Ninth Ward from a resource that was critical to its cultural identity and economic survival, but also the site of a human disaster from the site of an ecological disaster, integral parts of the catastrophe of Hurricane Katrina. Beginning in January 2006, a group of professors and students of landscape architecture at the University of Colorado made a commitment to accompany the lower Ninth Ward in its struggle for recovery for the next 3 years, asking, how can one live here? They appropriated approaches such as immersive ethnographies, counter mapping, etc., and were able to build trust with a community that was profoundly suspicious. Interviews and oral histories with older residents revealed the existence of a former cypress swamp and bayou to the north of the lower Ninth Ward. In 2006, it was completely invisible, hidden behind a triple barrier of undergrowth, rail lines, and the 6-meter-tall wall of steel sheet piling built in 1965 after Hurricane Betsy. It had also vanished from memory, save for the recollections of some residents over the age of 60. These confirmed that Bayou Bienvenue, as it was called, was one of the very sources of their livelihood, a resource for fishing, shrimping, other activities, forming important rituals and central parts of the identity and sense of belonging of the neighborhood, going back to the first dwellings by escaped slaves. In short, the Bayou Bienvenue was nothing less than fundamental for establishing the lower Ninth Ward landscape citizenship. Overcoming the sheet piling wall quickly became a centerpiece for the recovery, rebuilding, and reimagination of the lower Ninth Ward, its potential agency and efficacy extending way beyond its immediate spatial context. This was achieved by a 30-square-meter wooden platform and staircase, carefully conceived and designed over the course of a year and built literally overnight, in very much a transgressive operation, in 2008 by students, faculty, and with the help of local activists. I will have to maybe talk about a little bit of the subtext, since the statute of limitation is not quite expired yet over maybe beverages tonight. But again, if I use the word transgressive, it was very literally a transgressive operation. This platform, or the deck in local parlance, emerged very quickly as the most important location for this community to reconnect to its own contested histories and experiences and assert its identities for all conversations on wetland restoration, flood control, delta and coastal ecologies, rebuilding and reimagining, resilience and vulnerability, self-determination, and victimization. The 30 meters square are where many of these contentious liminalities coincide, intersect, and collide. It has become a local landmark with a high level of visibility and a required stop for visiting dignitaries. In fact, writes the sociologist Stéphane Tornelin, by making the bayou visible, the deck has also helped making the neighborhood viable. Its aesthetic experiential performance is a critical part of this agency and can be seen as an experiential dimension of belonging, something that environmental philosopher Arnaud Berléand refers to as being in process with one's environment. Standing on this edge makes present the story of the Bayou Bienvenue as a source of livelihood and identity turned into something uncanny, threatening, dangerous, by building a flood wall and separating it from the neighborhood. Now on the platform, the uncanny can become known again, engaged and lived with, and reintegrated into the socio-ecological futures the community begins to imagine and make real. The platform has very much become a public space in both senses of the word, as a space accessible to everyone and as a forum in which to discuss the future of the neighborhood and of the city in general, and how to live in an environment characterized by recurring and often violent negotiations of human and other than human processes. It represents both dimensions of the FAV's right to the city, access and participation. It continues the long-standing Black New Orleanian socio-political traditions of self-help, mutual aid, and resistance to structure of oppression that generated second lines and spatialized the concept of neutral ground. The deck allows a marginalized and traumatized community to participate in the discourses on its own future, to become co-authors of the landscape they inhabit, instead of being cast or self-identified as merely victims of external hegemonial agendas. A polyphonic narrative based in encounters with the other, in the immediate experiences of a complex environment of contentious internal liminality, and with the histories and narratives that created the identities of the lower Ninth Ward, has replaced the hegemonial narrative that ultimately created the landscape conditions responsible for the Hurricane Katrina disaster. Homi Bhabha most potently conceptualized and proposed a right to narrative as a key element of an individual and collective right to identity, and by extension of the right to place and landscape. These rights establish different forms of belonging and form inextricable elements of landscape citizenships. The platform in particular provides a space of encounter with many versions of the other, the strange, a third space in Bhabha's sense. He suggests invoking the marginal, the diasporic, and the uncanny, culture to be in a continual process of hybridity that produces and reproduces or enables new other identities and other positions, constantly differentiating and diversifying, evolving and emerging. The location and source of the uncanny, unhomely, unstable, and uncomfortable, then, is not from other places, but in fact from here. Edges, boundaries, and borders are very location where the destabilization of essentialist order and the production and reproduction of difference occurs, where the other emerges, is encountered, and cannot be avoided. In that way, they might also be where a kind of grounding occurs or takes place. That place, though, is not one of consensus, of homogeneity, of similarity, but one of contentious internal liminality, a place of discourse and discovery, a place that enables critical hermeneutic exchanges as a foundation for critical, contextual, relational, extant and emergent, coexisting, contested and contentious forms of belonging that form the basis for landscape citizenships. Such discursive, fluid, processual understanding of place, landscape, and identity then requires the use of the plural citizenships. The same physical location can enable, accommodate, and require multiple, simultaneous, alternate citizenships and belongings. The meaningful and effective enactment of belonging, of the rights to the city, to place, to landscape, and of landscape citizenships then occurs along a persistent continuity of producing and reproducing difference, of conflict and contestation, of encountering others, the other, strange and stranger, the uncanny, and more so, inviting them in. Living on edge and on the edge, in the margin, inhabiting this contentious liminality, a process of continuous engagements with alterity, are then required to make home, to belong, to be a good landscape citizen, and to, in the words of Donna Haraway, stay with the trouble, as a means of and a requirement for both survival and thriving. No more, but also no less. Thank you.